Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. In this episode I'm going to introduce you to fabric dyes, and in this video I will run through my dyeing process in detail. The first thing to bear in mind is that you need to use the correct dyes for the fabric, and I want to spend a few moments explaining which dyes to use. When I refer to cotton in this video, I mean the fabrics that are used with organic natural fibres including linen, hemp and bamboo. But as that is a mouthful, I will refer to this group of fabrics as cotton. First off, it's important to remember that there are a number of different types of fabric dyes, and each type caters for a specific type of fabric. To create batiks, you can use a variety of different materials, from fabrics, paper and even wood. Silk and cotton are the two most commonly used materials. Silk dyeing uses acid dyes, for instance, as silk requires a totally different way of dyeing to that used in batik painting on cotton, and the results are very different. Batik dyes for natural organic fibres are cold water fibre-reactive dyes. Let me explain what that means and break it down for you. The cold water element refers to the fact that these dyes are used cold, and this is important as if the dyes were hot when applied, any wax on the cloth would begin to melt and all your hard work creating wonderful wax marks would be lost. The second part is the term fibre-reactive. This means that when the dye is applied, the natural fibres and the dye actually form a chemical bond, making the dye in essence part of the fibres themselves. Let's go back and I'll explain what acid dyes are, just so you understand the difference. Acid dyes are used on silk. Now the fibres of silk are very different to those of, say, cotton. Silk comes from a species of moth, and these protein fibres are really quite tough to dye. I won't go into the chemistry, but in simple terms, an acid dye is mixed with, yes, you guessed it, a mild acid, such as vinegar or citric acid. The acid breaks down the toughness of the fibres and allows a bond to occur, and whatever acid used, the cloth must be heated to create the bond. So these two very popular types of dyes on the market have very different methods of dyeing, and each one can only work on the fibres that it's designed for. So when batik painting on cotton, only cold water fibre-reactive dyes can be used, and the most popular type of these dyes is a Procion dye. Now Procion used to be a brand of dyes. They were very popular and came from one single company. However, these days Procion is no longer a brand name, but a general word for a group of dyes, with Procion MX dyes being the correct dyes for use in batik on cotton. So if you're buying Procion dyes, make sure you buy them from the Procion MX range if you're using this fabric. Now these dyes come in a very fine powder, and when mixing these dyes, especially in large batches, you need to wear a mask. These particles are very small, and when inhaled, well, our lungs don't like it. Although you won't be aware of this, over time your body will develop a physical reaction to this exposure, and you will begin to notice the effects. So if you're regularly using cold water fibre-reactive dyes, it is advisable to wear a mask just when mixing up the powder. And although I don't find it necessary when using my dyes as I paint them onto the cloth, if you are using the immersion method, you will need to wear a pair of protective gloves. Procion dyes come as a dry powder and are non-reactive in that state. In other words, they're dormant until they're mixed with soda ash and water, and only then does the active dyeing process begin. Now, even when it comes to dyeing cotton with cold water dyes, there are a number of different ways that can be done. Some artists immersion dye their cloth, others pre-treat their cotton by soaking it in a soda ash bath. However, for me, the easiest and most effective way of using dyes to create a painting is to simply paint on the dyes as you would watercolours. Except that instead of using plain water, I mix up a chemical water to use with my dyes. This consists of water, soda ash and urea. The soda ash is the activator, creating chemical bonds between the dye and the fibres. Now urea is a wonderful chemical, and I guess you could call it an improver. It improves the depth and colour of the fabric, it delays the drying process to allow for a long dye, and it improves the spread and evenness of the colours. So it is pretty spectacular. even if traditionally the peasants used to pee in a barrel. But luckily, these days, urea is chemically produced, which personally I found quite comforting. Every artist's recipe will be slightly different depending on what is being dyed and how, as well as the temperature and humidity of the drying area. I tend to use less urea than most artists, but this seems to work for me here in cold and damp Wales. Well, to be fair, not all Wales is cold and damp, but we live in a mountain range, so the altitude affects our weather here. However, in hotter and drier climates, urea will be important to add in higher amounts if you want your work to be really colourful. Now, if you don't have a recipe for chemical water, I suggest that you start with mine and modify the ratios as necessary. So, to create my chemical water, firstly I pop my kettle on, and once it's boiled, let it cool just a little. Then I add 1 heaped teaspoon of soda ash and a similar amount of urea into a plastic jug, one with a lid. Then I simply add 1.5 pints or 0.85 litres of hot water to a jug, give it a good stir and leave it to cool to room temperature. You can store your chemical water with the lid on in a cool place, and it should be good for around 3 weeks, although mine never really lasts that long. When the dyes and the soda ash are mixed together in the water solution, the dyes become activated. This means that they are at their strongest and most powerful. However, this activation, almost from the beginning, will begin to decline, and after around 3 hours, it will not be effective enough to create strong and durable colours. In fact, to ensure the strongest and most successful results, it is recommended by some to stop using your activated dyes after only 30 minutes. But in reality, I tend to use my dyes for a painting session, which usually lasts around 3 hours. And if I'm dyeing with a dark or strong colour, then I'll mix up a new dye solution just for that job. Now, there are many different ways that you can dye fabric with these dyes, and a lot of the differences come down to what is being dyed. And traditional batik painting tends to use a method called immersion dyeing or vat dyeing. With this method, the fabric is submerged in a dye bath for a specific amount of time. Then the fabric is rinsed in clean water, dried and waxed, and further dyes are added in the same way. Now, immersion dyeing is quite a wasteful way of dyeing in my opinion, and it also prevents the painting from having any colour blends or other techniques included. So the results tend to look a little like screen prints. Now, don't get me wrong, this style of batik painting is wonderful. I just simply have a very different style, which makes vat dyeing inappropriate. Now, other artists use a combination with painting on the dyes and then vat dyeing the cloth with a strong black dye as the final stage, and this is a hybrid of the original dyeing process. Another way to dye the cloth in batik painting is to pre-soak the fabric in a mixture of soda ash and water, allow the fabric to fully dry, and then simply add water to the dyes and apply. The soda ash in this fabric activates the dyes instantly, and that is how the colours are created. Now, this process is a good way of working. However, I tend to work my cotton pretty hard, and if I'm doing a large and complex painting, I often rinse my fabric with clean water from time to time, which would obviously wash away the soda ash too. So for me personally, the chemical water approach works best. Now, I'm very lucky here as we have a wonderfully clean and soft water supply, which has always been good enough for using as part of my chemical water. However, if you live in a hard water area or your water is not that great, I recommend using filtered or bottled water for this. I have seen some batik artists recommend putting a water softener in their chemical mix. Now, I've never tried this, but if you do, just make sure that the pH of your chemical water is not affected in any way by this addition, and try out the solution on a piece of cloth for colour fastness and strength, just in case this addition is actually interfering in the chemical process, which is vital to ensure strong and long-lasting colours. Okay, so with all that explained, let me run through my personal dyeing process and explain some of the issues you need to be mindful of when working this way. Generally, I tend to work with only the 3 primary colours, yellow, magenta and turquoise, and a black. However, if I'm working with a restricted palette or have one colour which is dominant, I may use a specific pre-mixed colour or blend of colours in addition to these primaries. The reason for not using more pre-mixed colours is that in order to create really good batik paintings, you need to be in total control of how much of each of these primary colours you have applied to each area of your cloth. Now, I'll go into colour in a later video, although as colour is a quite complex thing to get your head around, I may be doing a series on this subject. So please remember to subscribe and activate the notifications if you want to know when these videos drop. When beginning a painting session, I tend to mix up a small amount of my 4 colours in separate pots with a small amount of chemical water. Now this will instantly activate the dyes, and so the clock kind of starts ticking on the effectiveness at this point. Try not to mix up too much of each colour, as you'll only have to throw it away at the end of the session. And as you can easily replenish your colours, less is more when creating your concentrated primary colours. Some artists mix their dyes in plain water and then only activate them when the chemical water is added as a method of dilution on their palette. This is a reasonable alternative to my approach, although if the brush containing the chemical water is dipped into the plain water solution, then the dyes will start to be activated anyway, and this can lead to a false idea that the dyes will last longer, which in essence they probably won't. So I tend to simply mix a very strong solution of each primary and a small amount of black in separate tubs and add another with just plain chemical water in it to dilute and mix the dyes on my palette. Once you get used to creating batiks, you can be quite accurate about the amounts you will need, and you can always add to your dyes if they begin to run out. I use my leftover dyes to experiment on paper and on fabric, so if you're like me and hate waste, store these used dyes in a jam jar and save them for that job. When mixing my primaries, I take some time with each colour, making sure that all the powder has been dissolved, and then all I need to do is to dilute and mix these primaries on a palette or in small pots. And by mixing each colour by hand, I know exactly how much of each primary colour has been added. So let me run through how I use my dyes and what I watch out for when using this method. As with all batik painting, you always dye from light and pale to bright and then dark. So after waxing in my whites, I begin by dyeing certain areas of my cloth with very pale diluted colours. Then, as I progress through my painting, the colours become brighter and then darker, ending usually with a black. There are a few things that happen with my process. Firstly, each dye application will have a little pigment that did not bond with the cotton, and although with the very pale colours I tend not to do this, as my painting becomes brighter and then darker, I will give the painting a quick rinse in cold tap water once the dyes are dried, just to make sure my painting stays crisp as it ages. You see, if you don't do this, then over time these excess dye particles will move around on the cloth, and you will discover that marks that used to be crisp and clean begin to look dirty and blurred. There is also another reason why I periodically wash my cloth. This is because with each successive colour I'm adding more and more soda ash to the fabric, and over time this builds up. This can impede future dyeing, and it also dyes to a white powder which spoils my painting. So by simply rinsing my paintings on the frame in cool water, I can manage this build-up and ensure that the fabric will dye properly in the later stages. One final thing here to mention is something called wax erosion. The soda ash will attack the edges of your wax marks and they will begin to deteriorate. Now this damage is only slight with each dye applied, but as more and more soda ash is applied to the cloth, this deterioration will begin to show. I'll cover what to do if this happens in a future video, but for now, just bear this in mind. Now many people specialise and focus on the dyeing process, and some even obsess over the clarity of their blacks. I'm not one of these wonderful people, who, without, I would never have learned so much as I have about dyeing a humble piece of cotton. When creating my work, I rarely need a consistent and specific effect. In fact, I kind of go for the opposite. So for me personally, the fine details of dyeing aren't really that important, although very interesting to read about. And it is worth remembering that as there are so many uses for these Procion MX dyes, every artist will have their own specific way of working and a set of rules that they follow. So if you're a batik artist, you may do things very differently to me. However, I hope that even an experienced artist has learned something here, and at the very least reminded you of some of the science. Okay, so this brings me to the end of this video. I haven't covered everything that you need to know, but I have covered the basics, and I'll be covering specific dyeing techniques along with some of the other rules for dyeing that I follow in future videos, as I think I have probably covered more than enough information here for the moment. In the next video, I'll be introducing you to colour mixing, and I will finally get some dyes onto cloth and begin to create. So thank you for watching. Please remember to hit the like button and subscribe if you found this video interesting and want to learn more. Until next time, just remember that whatever you do today, just make it creative.